Welcome to Tales by Imon. Tonight, we take you to the quiet heartland of America, where endless fields of gold hide the darkest of secrets. Settle in, as we unfold the mystery of the body in the cornfield. The first breath of October had finally chased away the last humid gasp of a Nebraska summer. It left behind a crisp, clean chill that bit at your cheeks and smelled of dry earth and decaying leaves. For the folks in Harmony Creek, it was a welcome change. It meant harvest season was in full swing, high school football games under bright Friday night lights, and the sweet, heavy scent of apple cider from Miller's farm. For me, Deputy Caleb Hayes, it usually meant dealing with nothing more exciting than a few lost cows or a domestic squabble fueled by a little too much cheap whiskey. That was the rhythm of things in a town of 2,000 souls, and I'd grown accustomed to its predictable, steady beat. That morning, however, the beat was broken. It started with a phone call that crackled through the receiver at the sheriff's department, just as the sun was painting the eastern sky in shades of pale orange and pink. It was Old Man Hemlock, a farmer whose property bordered the sprawling state lands to the south. His voice, usually a low, gravelly rumble, was a thin, reedy thing, stretched taut with a panic I'd never heard from him before. "Cal, you gotta get out here," he'd stammered, his words tumbling over each other. "Out past my number 4 field. The one that runs along the creek. There's something here. Something bad." I didn't press him for details. The tone in his voice was enough. Sheriff Brody was out of town for a regional conference until the next day, which left me as the sole authority in Harmony Creek. I grabbed my jacket, the keys to the cruiser, and was out the door in less than a minute, leaving my half-finished coffee steaming on the desk. The drive out to the Hemlock farm was familiar. I'd lived in Harmony Creek my whole life, save for 4 years in the Army. I knew every pothole in the county roads, every leaning fence post, every curve of the lazy creek that gave our town its name. But this morning, the familiar landscape felt different. The endless rows of corn, usually a comforting sight, seemed to press in on the road, their dry stalks whispering secrets on the morning breeze. The scarecrows, slumped and ragged in the fields, looked less like guardians of the harvest and more like silent, forgotten sentinels. I found Hemlock's rusted pickup truck parked haphazardly by a service gate, its driver's side door still hanging open. He was standing beside it, a stooped figure in faded overalls, his face ashen under the brim of his greasy baseball cap. He just pointed, his hand trembling, toward the dense wall of corn. "In there," he whispered, his eyes wide. "I was checking the irrigation line. I saw a boot." I told him to stay put, to not touch anything, and to wait by my cruiser. Then, I took a deep breath of the cold morning air and pushed my way into the cornfield. The stalks were well over 6 feet tall, dry and brittle. They rustled and cracked with every step I took, the sound unnervingly loud in the morning stillness. The air inside the rows was thick, heavy with the smell of damp soil and corn silk. It was like stepping into another world, a claustrophobic maze of green and gold that blocked out the sky. I followed a narrow path between the rows, my hand resting on the grip of my service weapon, my senses on high alert. After about 50 yards, the smell hit me. It was faint at first, a metallic coppery tang underneath the earthy scent of the field. It was the smell of blood. My stomach tightened. I slowed my pace, my eyes scanning the ground. I saw it a moment later. A single, black leather boot, lying on its side. Just like Hemlock said. A few feet beyond it, the corn stalks were broken and trampled, forming a small, unnatural clearing. And in the center of that clearing, he lay. He was a man, probably in his late 30s, dressed in clothes that were too nice for a cornfield. A dark blazer, now stained and rumpled, a pair of gray slacks, and one remaining polished boot. His other foot was bare. He lay on his back, his arms flung wide as if in a final, desperate embrace of the earth. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the dim light filtering through the corn canopy. His dark hair was matted with dew and something darker. I crouched down, careful not to disturb the ground around him. There was no visible wallet, no keys, no phone lying nearby. His pockets looked flat, empty. I didn't recognize him. In a town like Harmony Creek, a stranger stands out, and I'd never seen this man before in my life. He wasn't a local. He wasn't a farmhand. He was an outsider, brought to this quiet place for a violent end. His eyes were open, staring up blankly at the sliver of sky visible between the towering stalks. There was a single dark hole in the center of his chest, a stark, ugly contrast to the white of his button-down shirt. The area around it was soaked in a deep, dark crimson that had seeped into the fabric and the soil beneath him. There was no weapon in sight. No shell casings that I could see. Just the body, the trampled corn, and the profound, deafening silence of the field. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. This wasn't a hunting accident. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong on some lonely county road. This was deliberate. Someone had brought this man out here, into the heart of a cornfield, and ended his life. They had left him to be found by a 70-year-old farmer checking his irrigation lines. I backed away carefully, retracing my steps, preserving the scene as best I could. I pulled out my radio, the static hiss a welcome intrusion on the unnatural quiet. I needed to call it in, to get the state investigators and the coroner rolling. I needed to seal off the area. I needed to start asking questions that Harmony Creek hadn't had to ask in a very, very long time. As I stepped back out of the oppressive maze of corn and into the clear, open air, I looked back at the field. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the land. The rows of corn stood silent and impassive, a vast, golden ocean that had swallowed a man whole and offered no answers. The harvest would have to wait. Winter was coming, but a different kind of cold had just settled over our small, peaceful town. And I knew, standing there with a trembling old farmer and the wail of distant sirens beginning to cut through the morning air, that the steady, predictable rhythm of life in Harmony Creek was gone. It had been replaced by a single, haunting question that now lay hidden somewhere among the whispers of the corn. Who was the man in the field, and who put him there? The sirens grew from a distant cry to a deafening wail, tearing through the quiet fabric of the morning. Within 20 minutes, the dirt road leading to Hemlock's Field looked like a scene from a movie I'd only ever watched on TV. 2 state trooper cruisers arrived first, their lights flashing in a frantic, silent rhythm against the corn stalks. They were followed by the county coroner's van and, finally, the long, black vehicle of the Nebraska Bureau of Investigation. The official cavalry had arrived, and my brief tenure as lead on a homicide was officially over. A woman in a crisp gray pantsuit was the first one out of the NBI vehicle. She was maybe 40, with sharp, intelligent eyes and dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that meant she was all business. She moved with an air of authority that made the state troopers, both men twice her size, seem to stand up a little straighter. "Detective Isabella Rossi," she said, extending a hand as she approached. Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct. "You're Deputy Hayes?" "Yes, ma'am." "Cal Hayes," I replied. "The scene is just inside the corn line. I've kept everyone back. The farmer who found him is over by my cruiser." "Good work, Deputy." Her eyes swept over the scene, taking in the trampled grass, the tire tracks, my own footprints. She was reading the landscape like a page in a book. "Walk me in. Give me the rundown." As we walked back into that claustrophobic maze, I recounted everything, from Hemlock's panicked call to my initial observations of the body. She listened intently, her expression unreadable, pausing only to pull on a pair of blue latex gloves as we neared the clearing. Her forensics team, a pair of quiet, focused men, followed a few paces behind, their heavy cases filled with the tools of their trade. When she saw the body, Detective Rossi didn't flinch. She simply crouched down, her movements fluid and practiced, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "No wallet, no phone, you said?" Pockets felt empty from a visual inspection. "I didn't touch him," I confirmed. "Smart man," she murmured, more to herself than to me. She pointed a gloved finger toward the victim's bare foot. "One shoe off, one on. That's odd. Not typical of a robbery. A thief would be in a hurry, they wouldn't stop to untie a man's shoe. And his sock is clean. He didn't walk here barefoot." Her team began their work, a slow, methodical ballet of evidence collection. They photographed the body from every conceivable angle, measured distances, and began combing the ground in an ever-widening grid pattern. It felt invasive, clinical. This small patch of Nebraska soil, which had only ever known corn and sunlight, was now a sterile crime scene, cataloged and bagged for evidence. I left them to their work and went back to talk to Mr. Hemlock. I found him sitting in the passenger seat of my cruiser, clutching a paper cup of water I'd given him. His earlier panic had subsided, replaced by a deep, weary shock. "You doing okay, Bill?" I asked gently, leaning against the open door. He shook his head, not looking at me. 40 years I've farmed this land, Cal. 40 years. Seen droughts, floods, even a small tornado back in '98. Never seen anything like this. It feels unclean, like the ground itself is stained. I let him sit with that for a moment before I gently started asking questions. "Did you hear anything last night, Bill? Anything at all out of the ordinary?" He thought for a long time, his brow furrowed. "The dogs were barking some, around midnight maybe. But that ain't unusual. A coyote gets too close to the chickens, and they'll raise a fuss. I didn't think nothing of it." He paused. "There was a car though, earlier, maybe around 10 o'clock, headed down this access road. It's a dead end, you know. Only goes back to the old pump house by the creek. Nobody goes down there, especially not at night. Did you get a look at it? I asked, my interest piqued. Nah, it was too dark. Just saw the headlights sweep across my bedroom window. Figured it was just some kids looking for a place to park. Didn't hear it come back out, but I was asleep by then. It wasn't much, but it was something. A car on a dead-end road leading into the cornfields, late at night. I made a note of it. An hour later, the forensics team had finished their initial sweep. They'd found nothing. No murder weapon, no shell casing, no footprints other than mine and the victim's. It was as if he and his killer had materialized out of thin air. The ground is too hard, too dry, Detective Rossi explained, stripping off her gloves. Whoever did this got lucky. Left no impressions. The victim's pockets were empty. Not just empty, wiped clean. No lint, no dust. Nothing. His fingernails are clean, too. No signs of a struggle. So he knew his killer? I suggested. Went with him willingly? It's a possibility, she conceded. Or he was brought here after he was already incapacitated. The coroner will be able to tell us more. She looked at the body, which was now being carefully zipped into a black bag. For now, all we have is a ghost. No ID, no wallet, not even a watch or a ring. His suit has a tailor's label from a shop in Omaha, and his shoes are expensive Italian leather. This man had money. People with money don't just disappear without someone noticing. As the coroner's team loaded the gurney into the van, one of the state troopers called out to me. He was standing by the edge of the field, near the service road where Hemlock had parked. Deputy, he said, pointing to a fence post. This your handiwork? I walked over. A single strand of barbed wire on the fence had been deliberately cut. The cut was fresh, the metal shining brightly where the bolt cutters had sheared through it. It was a clean, quick way to gain access to the field without having to struggle with the heavy cattle gate a few yards down. It suggested planning, forethought. Detective Rossi came over to inspect it. They didn't come in through the gate, she observed. They came through here, quietly. We stood there for a moment, the three of us, looking at the small, severed piece of wire. It seemed like such a tiny detail in the grand scheme of things, but it felt significant. It was the first piece of the puzzle that suggested a methodical killer, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. By noon, the convoy of official vehicles had departed, taking our John Doe with them. They left behind a field cordoned off with bright yellow tape, a stark, ugly scar on the peaceful landscape. I was left with my thoughts and the lingering chill of the morning. Detective Rossi had told me they would run the victim's fingerprints and dental records through every database they had. She told me to canvass the area, to ask about any new faces or strange vehicles. Standard police work. But as I watched her car disappear down the road, kicking up a cloud of dust, I felt a frustrating sense of being left behind. This was my town, my home, and I had a feeling the answers weren't going to be found in some database in Omaha. They were here, buried somewhere in the soil of Harmony Creek, hidden behind the closed doors and watchful eyes of the people I'd known my whole life. Leaving the yellow tape and the violated stillness of Hemlock's farm behind felt like surfacing for air after being held underwater. The cruiser's engine was a low rumble, a familiar sound in a world that suddenly felt alien. My own reflection in the rearview mirror looked tired, the lines around my eyes deeper than they were when I woke up. The crime scene was now in Detective Rossi's capable hands, but the town, Harmony Creek, that was my responsibility. And right now, it was a powder keg of fear and rumor just waiting for a spark. My first stop wasn't the station. In a town this small, the official headquarters for information isn't the one with the flagpole out front, it's the one with the smell of brewing coffee and frying bacon. I parked the cruiser in front of The Daily Grind, our town's only diner. Its bell jingled merrily as I walked in, a cheerful sound that was completely at odds with the mood inside. Normally, the lunchtime rush would be a loud, happy chaos of farmers arguing over crop prices and families grabbing a quick bite. Today, the place was packed, but the noise level was a low, anxious hum. People were huddled in their booths, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward me the second I entered. Every conversation stopped. In that moment, I wasn't Cal Hayes, the kid who used to bag their groceries at the Piggly Wiggly. I was the uniform, the living symbol of the terrible news that had been spreading like wildfire all morning. Sarah, the diner's owner and head waitress, met me at the counter. She was a woman in her late 50s with a formidable beehive hairdo and a heart of gold, though she'd die before admitting it. She knew everything that happened in Harmony Creek before it even happened. Cal, she said, her voice low. She slid a heavy ceramic mug across the counter and filled it with steaming black coffee without asking. Is it true? What they're saying? That Bill Hemlock found a body. I took a slow sip of the coffee, letting the heat burn away some of the morning's chill. It's true, Sarah. We've got a John Doe. Homicide. A collective gasp went through the diner. The word homicide hung in the air, thick and ugly. It wasn't a word we used here. It belonged to the nightly news, to big cities like Omaha and Lincoln, not to our quiet corner of the world. Lord have mercy, Sarah whispered, placing a hand on her chest. I leaned against the counter. That's why I'm here. I need to know if anyone saw anything unusual. Last night, or even the past few days. A new face in town. A car that didn't belong. I raised my voice just enough for the rest of the diner to hear. The man we found wasn't from around here. He was wearing a dark suit, expensive clothes. Likely came in from out of town. The initial whispers erupted into a flurry of conversation. Old man Patterson, from his usual corner booth, swore he'd seen a dark sedan with tinted windows parked near the old grain silo 2 days ago. His wife immediately shushed him, reminding him that was the new bank manager's car. The chatter was mostly noise, unfounded theories, secondhand gossip, and a healthy dose of morbid curiosity. But I let them talk. Sometimes, a single, useful truth can get shaken loose from an avalanche of rumors. I was about to dismiss it all as a dead end when a young man sitting alone at the counter cleared his throat. It was Timmy Gable, a high school kid who worked part-time at the Gas and Go on the highway at the edge of town. Deputy, he said, his voice cracking slightly. He looked nervous, like a kid about to confess to breaking a window. I might have seen someone. I turned my full attention to him, pulling up the stool next to his. Go on, Timmy. I was working the late shift last night, he said, fiddling with a napkin. Closing up. It was around 9:30, maybe a quarter to 10. This car pulled in. A really nice one. A black Lexus sedan. It was brand new, didn't even have permanent plates yet, just one of those paper tags in the back window. This got my attention. It fit. A man in an expensive suit would drive an expensive car. Did you get a look at the driver? Yeah. He came in to pay for gas. He was, like you said, a city guy. Nice suit, fancy shoes, slicked back hair. Looked like one of those corporate lawyer types. He bought a full tank of premium and a bottle of water. Paid with $100 bill. Did he say anything? Where he was going? Timmy shook his head. No, he was on his phone. Seemed agitated. He was talking low, but he sounded angry. Arguing with someone. I remember he said, just tell me where to meet you. I'm already on my way. Then he hung up, paid, and left. Didn't even take his change. My mind started racing. This was the first real lead. A potential sighting of our victim, alive, just hours before he was killed. Which way did he go when he left, Timmy? The kid paused, thinking hard. That was the weird part. He didn't get back on the highway toward Omaha. He turned right, onto County Road 4. He headed east. I felt a jolt. County Road 4. It was a quiet, 2-lane blacktop that wound its way through miles of farmland. It wasn't a shortcut to anywhere, but if you followed it for about 5 miles, you'd come across a little-used, unmarked dirt access road. A dead-end road that led directly to the old pump house by the creek, right alongside the back end of Bill Hemlock's property. The same road where Bill had seen the headlights. Did you happen to see the number on the paper license plate? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Timmy's face fell. I'm sorry, Deputy. I didn't really look that close. It was dark, and I was just trying to close out the register. It's all right, Timmy. You did great, I reassured him. You've been a huge help. I finished my coffee in one long swallow, the bitter liquid doing little to calm the nervous energy that was now coursing through me. I dropped a few dollars on the counter and gave Sarah a nod. The diner was still buzzing, but now their eyes on me held a different look. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was a glimmer of hope. As I walked out into the bright October afternoon, the case suddenly felt different. It was no longer just a body in a field. It had a starting point. A black Lexus, a heated phone call, and a man in a suit turning down a dark county road he had no business being on. Our ghost now had a shadow. He had been angry, he had been driving to meet someone, and that meeting had cost him his life. I didn't have a name yet, but for the first time, I had a trail to follow. And it started just a few miles down the road, at a lonely gas station on the edge of my town. The drive from the diner to the Gas and Go on the edge of town took less than 3 minutes, but in my head, a dozen different scenarios were playing out. A lead based on the memory of a nervous teenager was one thing, hard evidence was another. Everything depended on whether the gas station security system was more than just a dusty decoration meant to deter kids from shoplifting candy bars. I pulled the cruiser up next to the pumps, the same spot where the black Lexus had been just over 12 hours ago. The owner, a perpetually stressed man named Dale, was behind the counter wiping down the coffee machine. He looked up as I came in, his face a mixture of curiosity and dread. News traveled fast, and he clearly knew this wasn't a social call. "Cal," he said, setting his cleaning rag aside. "Heard about the trouble out at the Hemlock place. Awful business." "It is, Dale," I agreed, getting straight to the point. "I have reason to believe our victim may have stopped here last night. Timmy Gable was working the counter." Dale nodded slowly. "Yeah, Timmy's a good kid. Closed up for me last night. I need to see your security footage from yesterday evening," I said. "Specifically between 9 and 10 p.m. at the front counter and the pump facing the highway." A pained look crossed Dale's face, and for a second, my heart sank. I expected him to tell me the cameras were broken or that the system only stored a few hours of footage. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "The one on pump 3 has been acting up, but the main one should be fine. The system is in the back office. Come on." He led me into a cluttered, windowless room that smelled of stale coffee and motor oil. A small monitor sat on a metal desk, displaying a grainy, four-way split of the station's cameras. Dale expertly clicked a mouse, his fingers flying across the keyboard to navigate the clunky, outdated software. He pulled up the archive from the previous night, and we began to watch. The footage was black and white, the timestamp in the corner glowing a stark green. We watched cars come and go and fast forward, their headlights streaking across the screen. Then, at 9:43 p.m., just as Timmy had said, a sleek, dark sedan pulled up to pump number 2. It was impossible to make out the make and model with certainty from the grainy overhead camera, but it was low, wide, and looked expensive. It looked like a Lexus. A man got out. The camera angle wasn't ideal, but it was him. Even in the ghostly white of the security footage, the sharp cut of his suit was apparent. He moved with a confident, hurried stride. We switched to the indoor camera. There he was again, clearer this time, standing at the counter. He was on his phone, his expression tight with frustration, just as Timmy described. He gestured with his free hand as he spoke, his body language radiating tension. He paid, turned, and walked out of the frame. "Can you rewind that?" I asked, leaning closer to the screen. "Right when he gets back in his car." Dale rewound the footage. We watched the man walk back to the Lexus. He opened the door, but before he got in, he paused. He looked back over his shoulder, toward the dark expanse of the highway, as if expecting to see someone. He stayed like that for a full 5 seconds, a silhouette frozen in a moment of apprehension, before finally sliding into the driver's seat. "Okay, now play it forward." As he pulls away, I instructed. The car's taillights flared to life. The driver didn't signal, but he made a sharp right turn onto County Road 4. Another confirmation of Timmy's story. As the car accelerated, the rear of the vehicle came into perfect view of the camera covering the station's exit. "Stop. Zoom in there," I ordered, pointing at the back window. Dale clicked and dragged, enlarging the pixelated image. And there it was. Taped to the inside of the rear window was a white rectangle, a temporary license plate. The image was blurry, distorted by the night vision camera, but it was there. We couldn't make out the whole number, but the last 3 digits were shockingly clear. 501. "Can you print that frame?" I asked, my voice tight with excitement. "You bet," Dale said, a grin finally breaking through his worried expression. A few minutes later, I walked out of the gas and go holding a flimsy piece of paper with a grainy, black and white picture of the back of a Lexus. It felt like I was holding the key to the entire investigation. It wasn't just a ghost anymore. Our John Doe was the driver of a new, dark-colored Lexus sedan with a temporary tag ending in 501. My first call was to Detective Rossi. I caught her as she was leaving the coroner's office. I explained what I had, from the kid's testimony at the diner to the security footage and the partial plate number. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "A black Lexus with a temp tag ending in 501, she repeated, her voice crisp and professional. "Deputy Hayes, that's excellent work. Truly." The unexpected praise felt better than I cared to admit. "I thought you'd want to know," I said. "I've already got a team running a search through the DMV's recent registrations," she said, her tone all business again, focusing on the Omaha and Lincoln areas first. "A partial plate narrows the field considerably. It'll still take time, but we're no longer shooting in the dark. I'll let you know as soon as we get a hit." "What do you want me to do now?" I asked. Keep doing what you're doing, she replied. You know the area better than we do. Keep canvassing. See if anyone else saw that car last night on County Road 4. Someone driving a Lexus through farmland after dark might stick in a person's memory. You found the thread, Cal. Now let's see where it leads. She called me Cal. I hung up the phone feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The state investigators had the technology and the resources, but I had the town. I had Dale at the Gas and Go, Sarah at the diner, and a lifetime of knowing the people who lived on these quiet county roads. Detective Rossi was right. We had a thread, and I was going to be the one to pull it until this whole thing unraveled. My next stop was clear. I had to talk to the handful of farmers and families who lived along that lonely stretch of County Road 4. Someone else must have seen something. County Road 4 was less of a road and more of a suggestion. It was a strip of weathered blacktop that cut a straight, lonely line through an endless ocean of corn and soybeans. The farmhouses out here were islands, set far back from the road, separated by vast tracts of land and a shared understanding that privacy was the most valuable commodity. Driving down it, I felt the scale of the county in a way I never did in town. Out here, you could shout and the only thing that would hear you was the wind. It was the perfect place to make someone disappear. My task was simple, if tedious: knock on every door. There were only 4 homesteads along the 5-mile stretch between the highway and the access road to the crime scene. The first was the Miller Dairy Farm. I found Mrs. Miller in the barn, her hands chapped and red from her work. She was kind but couldn't help me. Her family was in bed by 9 every night, exhausted from the day's labor. They hadn't seen or heard a thing. The second house belonged to a young couple who had just moved from the city, seeking a quieter life. Their lights were off, and a note on the door indicated they were in Lincoln for the day. I left my card and made a mental note to circle back. 2 houses down, 2 strikes. The frustration was beginning to simmer. My third stop was the Peterson place. It was the oldest and most remote of the 4, a classic 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that was sagging in the middle. A rusty weather vane spun lazily on the roof of the barn. This was the home of Eleanor Peterson, a widow in her late 70s who had lived on this road her entire life. She was known around town for 2 things: her prize-winning pumpkin pies and her uncanny ability to know everything that happened within a 10-mile radius of her porch swing. If anyone had seen a black Lexus on this road, it was her. I found her on that very swing, a heavy wool blanket draped over her lap despite the mild afternoon sun. She watched me walk up the path with sharp, bird-like eyes, her expression giving nothing away. "Afternoon, Eleanor," I said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Caleb," she replied, her voice surprisingly strong. "I suppose you're here about the unpleasantness out on the Hemlock property. It's all anyone can talk about." "Yes, ma'am. That's why I'm here. I'm trying to track a car that might have been on this road last night. A new, black luxury sedan. Maybe a Lexus." She stopped swinging and fixed her gaze on the horizon, as if replaying the previous night in her mind. "Black Lexus. Yes, I saw it. Came tearing down this road like the devil himself was chasing it. Far too fast for this kind of pavement." I felt a now familiar jolt of adrenaline. "What time was this, Eleanor?" "It was during my show," she said with certainty. "Right during the second commercial break of the 10 o'clock news. So, about 10:15, I'd say." Her timeline was a little later than Timmy's, but it made perfect sense. It would take about 15 to 20 minutes to drive from the Gas and Go to her farmhouse. "Did you see where it went?" "It went all the way to the end of the road," she said, pointing a bony finger eastward. "Turned down the old service lane. I thought it was strange. No one goes down there but the county water inspectors, and they don't work at night." She paused, and a shrewd look entered her eyes. "But that wasn't the only one." My blood ran cold. "The only one?" "No," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "There was another vehicle already waiting for him." I took a slow breath, trying to process the implications. Our victim wasn't just driving to a location, he was driving to a rendezvous. "What kind of vehicle, Eleanor? Can you describe it?" "It was parked just inside the access road, with its lights off. I almost didn't see it," she explained. "It was an old pickup truck. One of those beat-up workhorses. Dark color, maybe green or blue, hard to tell in the dark. It was dirty, caked in mud, like a farm truck." This was a bombshell. A planned meeting. The expensive Lexus from the city and a beat-up farm truck from the country. "Did you see the driver?" She shook her head, a hint of genuine disappointment on her face. "No. The Lexus pulled in, and its headlights lit up the truck for just a second before the driver turned them off. The doors opened and closed, but I couldn't see anyone clearly from this distance. They were just shadows. How long were they there? Not long. Maybe 10 minutes. Then I heard it. She paused, her eyes clouding over. It was a sound, sharp and quick, like a firecracker. I thought it was just a car backfiring, but it felt wrong. It was so quiet out here last night, and that sound just cut right through the stillness. A gunshot. She had heard the gunshot. And after the sound, I prodded gently. A few minutes later, the truck's engine started up. Not the Lexus. The truck. It backed out of the service road and drove away, heading back west, toward the highway. And the Lexus? It just stayed there, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It never moved. Its lights never came back on. I knew then that something terrible had happened. I stood at the bottom of her porch steps, the world tilting slightly on its axis. We weren't just looking for a killer anymore. We were looking for a person who drove an old, muddy, dark-colored pickup truck. That described half the vehicles in the county. But it was a lead, a massive one. The killer wasn't some slick associate from the city. It was someone local. Someone who knew these back roads. Someone who drove a farm truck. I thanked Eleanor profusely, promising to have a trooper stationed at the end of her road for the next few nights to make her feel safer. As I walked back to my cruiser, my mind was a whirlwind. Our victim, the man in the suit, had driven all the way from the city to meet someone in the middle of nowhere. Someone he likely knew, and that someone had been waiting for him with a gun. The case had just been turned inside out. The killer wasn't an outsider who had brought trouble to our town. The trouble was already here, waiting in the darkness at the edge of a cornfield. My hand was shaking slightly as I pulled the cruiser over to the side of the road, the engine idling in the quiet afternoon. I took a moment, letting Eleanor Peterson's words sink in. An old, muddy pickup truck. The detail was both a massive break and a logistical nightmare. In a county like ours, that description fit hundreds of vehicles. It was as common as a John Deere hat. But it reframed everything. The killer wasn't a ghost from the city, he was one of our own. I grabbed my radio, my thumb pressing the transmit button. Dispatch, patch me through to Detective Rossi. The connection crackled. Go ahead, Deputy, Rossi's voice came through, sharp and clear. I laid it all out for her. The elderly witness, her precise timeline, the black Lexus arriving to meet a second vehicle, the description of the pickup truck, the single gunshot, and the truck leaving alone. I relayed every detail Eleanor had given me. For a moment, the line was silent. I could almost picture her on the other end, processing, analyzing, the gears in her mind turning at high speed. A local rendezvous, she finally said, her voice tight with intrigue. That changes things. It gives us a motive, a context. This wasn't a random act. Our John Doe came here for a reason, and that reason got him killed. My thoughts exactly, I said. I'll put out a bolo, be on the lookout, for any dark-colored, older model pickup. It's a long shot, but maybe someone noticed a truck with fresh mud on it where it shouldn't be. Do it, she commanded. But I have something for you as well. Something that might give us a name to go with that motive. There was a pause. We got a hit on the partial plate. My grip on the radio tightened. You did. The DMV cross-referenced all recent temporary registrations for new Lexus sedans in the state, ending in 501. They found a match 20 minutes ago. The car was registered 3 days ago to a Michael Reed of Omaha, age 38, address in the West Side District. He's a partner in a high-end real estate development firm. Michael Reed. The ghost had a name. It felt solid, real. A 38-year-old real estate developer from Omaha. A man with a life, a career, and presumably, people who were wondering where he was. Did you notify the family? I asked. A team from the Omaha PD is on their way to the residence now to make the notification, Rossi said. I'll be heading there myself to speak with the wife. I need to know everything about Michael Reed's life, his business deals, his enemies. But Cal, I need you to work it from your end. A man like Reed doesn't drive an hour and a half out to the middle of nowhere for no reason. He had a connection to Harmony Creek. Find it. The call ended, leaving me with a new, urgent mission. Find the link. I turned the cruiser around and headed not for the station, but for the county courthouse in the center of town. It was a stately aging brick building that housed decades of records, deeds, permits, lawsuits, and disputes. If Michael Reed had business in our county, the proof would be filed away in a dusty cabinet somewhere in that building. Brenda, the county clerk, looked up from her crossword puzzle as I entered. She was a fixture in the courthouse, a woman who knew the county's legal history better than any lawyer. "Cal, what brings you to my humble hall of records?" she asked, a smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "Official business, Brenda," I said, leaning on her tall counter. "I need to do a search. The name is Michael Reed. Also, the name of his firm, Apex Land Holdings." Her eyebrows shot up. "Apex. Oh, I know that name. They've been sniffing around here for a few months now." She swiveled in her chair and began tapping at her computer. "Let's see what we've got." For the next hour, Brenda and I sifted through digital files and pulled old, heavy ledger books. And slowly, a picture began to form. Apex Land Holdings, with Michael Reed listed as the primary agent, had been systematically buying up options on farmland all along the eastern edge of the county. They had acquired options on the Miller property, the land belonging to the young couple who were out of town, and 3 other adjacent farms. Their goal was clear. They were assembling a massive parcel of land. "What for?" I asked, looking at the map Brenda had pulled up, the properties outlined in red. "Rumor is they're trying to get a zoning variance for a major commercial development," Brenda said, lowering her voice. "Something to do with alternative energy. Wind turbines, I heard. A whole forest of them. A wind farm. That would be the biggest, most controversial project in the county's history. It would change the landscape forever and make a handful of people very rich, while potentially upsetting many others." And then I saw it. The last piece of the puzzle. There was one property, a crucial one, sitting right in the middle of Apex's target area that they hadn't acquired. It was a 160-acre plot that broke their contiguous block of land. Without it, the project was likely unfeasible. I pointed to the square on the map. "Whose land is this?" Brenda peered at the screen, her finger tracing the property line. "Well, that's the holdout. The one farm that's been in the same family for 100 years and has refused every offer Apex has thrown at them." She clicked the mouse, and the ownership information popped up. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the name on the screen, a name I knew all too well. It was a name associated with stubbornness, a short temper, and a deep, abiding distrust of outsiders. The land belonged to the Hemlock family. It was Bill Hemlock's farm. The same farm where Michael Reed's body was found, just a few hundred yards from the property line of the very land he so desperately needed to acquire. The name on the screen seemed to burn itself into my mind. Hemlock. I stood there in the quiet of the county clerk's office, the low hum of the computer the only sound, and felt the floor drop out from beneath me. Bill Hemlock wasn't just the man who found the body. He was the man with the most powerful motive in the world to want Michael Reed gone. His land, his legacy, his entire way of life. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the two images of him. There was the Bill Hemlock I'd known forever, the gruff farmer who gave out the biggest candy bars on Halloween and always waved from his tractor. And then there was this new theoretical Bill Hemlock, a man backed into a corner by a powerful developer, a man with a dark green pickup truck. I'd seen it in his barn 100 times, and a man who had stood over a dead body and called the police, pretending to be a shocked and innocent bystander. Could the man who found the body also be the man who pulled the trigger? My professional duty slammed back into place, overriding my personal disbelief. I thanked a now very concerned-looking Brenda, telling her I'd need copies of all the Apex land option documents. Then I stepped outside into the sharp autumn air and called Detective Rossi. "You're certain?" she asked after I explained the connection, her voice devoid of any surprise. It was as if she had expected the neat, tidy narrative. The greedy developer, the stubborn farmer. It was a story as old as the land itself. "The records are clear," I said, my own voice sounding distant to my ears. "Hemlock's farm is the linchpin. Without it, the wind farm project is dead in the water. He's been refusing to sell for months." "Motive," Rossi stated flatly. "And he has a vehicle matching the witness's description. He put himself at the scene of the crime by reporting it. It could be a classic blunder, trying to appear innocent by being the one to raise the alarm." "It's possible," I conceded, though the words felt like ash in my mouth. "I want you to go talk to him, Cal," she ordered. "Don't spook him. Just a follow-up conversation. See what he says when you mention Michael Reed's name. I want to know if his story changes. I'm an hour out from Omaha. Keep me on a secure line if you can. I want to hear this." The drive back out to the Hemlock farm was the longest of my life. Every turn in the road felt heavy with dread. This morning I had driven this same route to a crime scene. Now, I was potentially driving to confront a killer who I'd known since I was a boy. I found him in his barn, just as I'd pictured. He was trying to fix a piece of machinery, his large, weathered hands covered in grease. His old dark green Ford pickup was parked in the bay next to him, its tires and fenders caked in the same dark, loamy soil as the fields around us. It matched Eleanor's description perfectly. He looked up when he saw me, his face wary. "Back again, Cal? They figure out who that poor soul was yet." I leaned against the barn door, trying to keep my posture relaxed, my voice even. "We did, Bill. His name was Michael Reed, a real estate developer from Omaha." I watched his face carefully. There was no flicker of recognition, no visible reaction at all. He just grunted and turned a wrench with a loud screech of metal on metal. "City fella. Figured as much. No business being out here." "His company is called Apex Land Holdings," I continued, letting the name hang in the air between us. "They've been buying up land in this area." This time, he froze. He slowly straightened up, his back stiff, and wiped his greasy hands on a red rag. His eyes, when they met mine, were hard as flint. "Apex," he spat the name like a curse. "Vultures. That's what they are. Trying to steal a man's heritage for a fistful of dollars." "They made you an offer, I assume?" "Offers," he scoffed. "Threats is more like it. That Reed fella called me a dozen times, pestering me, said I was standing in the way of progress, said he'd make me an offer I couldn't refuse. I told him to go to hell. This farm was my father's, and his father's before him. It's not for sale." The anger radiating from him was palpable. It was a deep, simmering rage, the kind of rage that could make a man do something desperate. "So you knew who he was when you found him this morning?" I asked, the question sharp and direct. His eyes narrowed. "What are you getting at, son? I found a body in my field. I didn't ask for his driver's license. It was a man in a suit, shot dead. That's all I knew, all I cared about." "Where were you last night, Bill?" "Around 10:30. He threw the wrench into a toolbox with a loud clang. "Where do you think I was?" "I was in my house, asleep. Where I am every night. Can anyone confirm that?" "Confirm it," he roared, his face turning a deep shade of red. "The dog. You want to ask my dog for my alibi? I live alone, Caleb, you know that. What is this? Am I some kind of suspect now?" "I have a witness who saw a truck that looks a lot like yours meeting a black Lexus on the service road last night, right around the time our coroner says Michael Reed was killed," I said, my voice firm. He stared at me, his mouth hanging slightly open. For the first time, the anger in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else. Fear. "That wasn't me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, hoarse whisper. "I was in my bed. I swear on my wife's grave, I was home." His denial was passionate, absolute. But it was exactly what a guilty man would say. He had the motive. He had the means. Every farmer owns a rifle. He drove the right truck. And his alibi was non-existent. The circumstantial evidence was piling up into a mountain. "Bill," I said, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, "I need you to come into town with me. We just need to get a formal statement." He looked at me, his face a mask of betrayal. He looked past me, at the fields his family had worked for a century. He looked at the barn his father had built with his own 2 hands. Then he looked back at me, the local boy he'd watched grow up, who was now here to accuse him of murder. He sighed, a deep, rattling sound of utter defeat, and nodded his head. "All right, Cal. Let's go." The interrogation room at the Harmony Creek Sheriff's Department was a small, cinderblock box painted a depressing shade of institutional beige. It had 1 table, 3 chairs, and a single bare bulb overhead that cast harsh shadows on anyone who sat beneath it. I'd only ever used it to sober up the occasional drunk or scare a teenager who'd been caught vandalizing property. I never thought I'd see Bill Hemlock sitting at that table, his big, calloused hands resting awkwardly on the steel surface. Detective Rossi had arrived while I was booking him, sweeping into the station like a storm front. She was all sharp angles and focused energy. She'd read my preliminary report, and now she sat opposite Hemlock, a slim folder on the table in front of her. I sat in the 3rd chair, off to the side, my official role to observe and take notes, but I knew my real purpose was to be a familiar face from home in a room that was anything but. "Mr. Hemlock," Rossi began, her voice calm and even, "thank you for coming in. We just need to clarify a few things. You understand you are not under arrest at this time, but you are here to assist us with a homicide investigation." Bill just grunted, his eyes fixed on a crack in the wall just over Rossi's shoulder. "Let's go back to your calls with Michael Reed," Rossi continued, opening her folder. "You admit he contacted you several times about selling your property." "I told your boy here," Bill said, jerking his head in my direction. The man was a pest. Wouldn't take no for an answer. Called my home at all hours. Arrogant. Did you ever agree to meet with him in person to discuss his offer? Rossi asked, her gaze unwavering. Never, Bill snapped. Told him I had nothing to discuss. Told him to lose my number. And yet, a witness saw a truck identical to yours meeting Mr. Reed's car at the edge of your property on the night he was murdered, Rossi said, letting the statement hang in the silent room. And you heard nothing? A car arriving, a gunshot. You were supposedly asleep just a few hundred yards away. I'm a heavy sleeper, Bill said, his voice low and stubborn. And I ain't responsible for every vehicle that drives down a county road. But this vehicle wasn't just driving down the road, Mr. Hemlock. It stopped. It met the man who was trying to take your farm. A man you admit you despised. And then that man ended up dead. You have to admit, it doesn't look good. I don't care how it looks, he growled. I know what I did. And I didn't do that. The interrogation went on like that for another hour. Rossi was relentless, circling back again and again, poking at his story from different angles. She asked about his finances, about the guns he owned. Bill answered bluntly. He was in debt, like most farmers, but he always paid his bills. He owned a 12-gauge shotgun for shooting crows and a .22 rifle for gophers. Neither was a handgun, and neither matched the probable caliber of the murder weapon, based on the coroner's initial report. Through it all, his story never changed. He was home. He was asleep. He found the body the next morning on his way to check his irrigation lines, just like he said. He was a terrible liar, or he was telling the absolute truth. I couldn't decide which. Then Rossi slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of Michael Reed, a candid shot of him smiling with his family. A wife and 2 small children. This is the man you say you never met, Mr. Hemlock. He has a family. 2 little girls who are going to grow up without a father because of a dispute over some land. Bill looked down at the photo. His hard expression faltered for just a fraction of a second. He stared at the picture of the smiling children, and a deep sigh escaped his chest, a sound of profound weariness. It's a bad business, he said quietly, pushing the photo back across the table. I never wished the man dead. I just wished he'd go away. He looked up, first at Rossi, then at me. Find the man who did this. You're wasting your time with me. There was no confession. There were no cracks in his story, no slips of the tongue. All Rossi had was a mountain of circumstantial evidence that was damning but, for now, not definitive. Without the murder weapon or a witness who could place Bill himself, not just his truck, at the scene, there wasn't enough to charge him. Eventually, Rossi closed her folder. All right, Mr. Hemlock. You're free to go. But don't leave the county. We'll be in touch. I walked Bill out to the front lobby. The station was empty, the afternoon sun slanting through the dusty windows. He paused at the door, turning to me. You really think I did it, Cal? He asked, his voice raw. I met his gaze. I think the evidence points your way, Bill. It's my job to follow it. He just shook his head, a look of deep disappointment on his face, and walked out the door, a free man who was now a prisoner in his own town. I went back to the interrogation room where Rossi was packing up her briefcase. He's our man, she said with conviction. He's just too stubborn to admit it. He'll make a mistake. They always do. We'll find the gun he used, probably ditched somewhere on his property. We'll get a search warrant for his farm in the morning. Maybe, I said, the word coming out before I could stop it. She paused, looking at me. You have doubts. It's neat, I said, struggling to find the right words. It's almost too neat. He's the perfect suspect. The angry old farmer fighting the rich developer. It's a story everyone would believe. Sometimes the simplest story is the true one, Cal. And sometimes, I countered, it's the one someone wants you to believe. Rossi gave me a long, evaluating look. Go home, get some rest, she said, her tone softening slightly. We'll hit his farm hard tomorrow. I nodded and left the station, but her words didn't sit right. As I drove through the quiet streets of my town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't just following the evidence. We were being led by it. And if Bill Hemlock didn't do it, that meant the real killer was still out there. Someone who not only murdered Michael Reed but had been clever enough to point all the evidence at an old man in a beat-up farm truck. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the interrogation in my head, the image of Bill Hemlock's betrayed face, the unwavering confidence in Detective Rossi's eyes. Every instinct I had was screaming that we were walking down the wrong path, a path that someone had conveniently paved for us. The simplest story is often the true one, Rossi had said. But Harmony Creek wasn't a simple place, and I was beginning to suspect this murder wasn't a simple story. The next morning, I met Rossi and a 4-person state forensics team at the turnoff to the Hemlock Farm. The sun was bright, but the air held a deep, unforgiving chill. It was the kind of morning that felt like a prelude to winter. Bill was waiting on his porch, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands. He looked like he hadn't slept either. He just gave a single tired nod as the team of strangers, armed with a warrant, began to file past him into the home his family had occupied for a century. Rossi was direct and professional. "We're going to be thorough, Mr. Hemlock, but we'll be respectful of your property," she told him. "We're looking for a firearm, specifically a handgun, and any ammunition that might match." I watched as they started the grid search, a slow, meticulous process that felt like a violation. They went through his house first, opening drawers, looking under beds, checking closets. Then they moved to the barn, sifting through piles of old tools, hay bales, and machinery. It was a hunt for a needle in a haystack, and my gut told me the needle wasn't there. I couldn't just stand by and watch them tear apart Bill's life based on a theory that felt increasingly hollow. "Detective," I said, approaching Rossi as she directed 2 techs toward the farm's small workshop. "While your team is busy here, I want to go back to the primary crime scene. Take another look." She raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "My team swept that field twice. It's clean." "Maybe," I said. "But they were looking for evidence without a context." "We all were. Now we have a narrative, a theory. I want to see if the scene still fits that theory when you look at it up close." She considered it for a moment, then shrugged. "Fine. Can't hurt. But the answer is here, Cal. In this barn or buried in that yard." I left them to their work and drove the short distance to the service road. The yellow tape was still up, fluttering in the breeze like a sad, forgotten party streamer. I ducked under it and walked back into the cornfield, the dry stalks rustling around me. The clearing where we found Michael Reed's body was just as we'd left it, only now the ground was scuffed with the footprints of a dozen investigators. I stood at the edge of the trampled circle, trying to picture the scene as Eleanor Peterson had described it. The Lexus pulls in. The pickup is waiting. 2 shadows emerge. An argument, maybe. 10 minutes pass. Then the shot. The forensics team had searched for a shell casing and found nothing. It was one of the reasons a revolver might have been considered. They don't automatically eject casings. But a semi-automatic pistol would have. The killer could have picked it up, of course. A careful killer would. But the man Eleanor described, driving a muddy farm truck, meeting someone in a field, did that sound like a meticulous assassin? Or someone angry, sloppy, and desperate? I started my own search, my eyes on the ground, scanning the dirt and leaf litter. I ignored the center of the clearing, where the body had been, and focused on the perimeter. Where would the killer have stood? He would want the advantage, maybe standing just at the edge of the corn, using the stalks for cover. I moved to the spot where the pickup truck would have been parked, a place slightly obscured from the road. I knelt, my fingers brushing away dry leaves. I worked slowly, my focus absolute. I was looking for anything out of place. Anything that didn't belong in a cornfield. 10 minutes turned into 20. My knees ached, and my hope began to fade. Maybe Rossi was right. Maybe I was just chasing ghosts because I didn't want to believe a man I knew was a murderer. And then I saw it. A tiny glint of brass, almost completely covered by a clod of dirt. It was nestled right at the base of a thick corn stalk, a place the wide sweeps of the forensics team could have easily missed. My heart hammered against my ribs. I carefully pulled a pair of gloves and an evidence bag from my pocket. Using a twig, I gently worked the object loose from the soil. It was a shell casing. I held the bag up to the light. The casing was small, brassy, and stamped on the bottom with 3 numbers and a letter, 9mm. It was from a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, one of the most common handgun calibers in the world. And it was a world away from the shotguns and rifles Bill Hemlock had told us he owned. I stood up, the small plastic bag feeling as heavy as a brick in my hand. This changed everything. This was the physical evidence that directly contradicted the case against Bill Hemlock. A farmer settling a grudge might use the rifle he had handy. But a 9mm pistol? That suggested something else entirely. It was the kind of weapon someone brings to a meeting when they're expecting trouble. I turned and looked back in the direction of the Hemlock farm, hidden from view by the rolling fields. Rossi's team was still there, searching for a weapon that wasn't there, building a case against a man who was, I was now almost certain, innocent. The real killer hadn't been sloppy after all. They had been incredibly smart. They had committed a murder and left behind the perfect suspect, counting on us to never look past the obvious. But they had made one small mistake. They had missed one tiny piece of brass, and I was holding it in my hand. The walk back out of the cornfield felt entirely different from the walk in. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by a thrum of energy, a sense of clarity that cut through the confusion of the past 2 days. I clutched the evidence bag in my hand, the small brass casing a solid, tangible piece of truth in a case that had been built on assumptions and circumstantial anger. I didn't bother with the radio. This was a conversation that needed to happen face to face. I drove the short distance back to the Hemlock farm, my tires kicking up dust on the gravel road. The state forensics team was still at work, but their movement seemed slower now, their expressions tinged with the frustration of a fruitless search. They hadn't found a thing, and they knew it. I found Detective Rossi near the barn, looking at Bill Hemlock's dark green pickup truck. She was on her phone, likely getting an update from her team in Omaha about Michael Reed's business dealings. She ended the call as I approached, her eyes questioning. "Find your peace of mind, Cal?" she asked, her tone suggesting she expected me to have come up empty-handed. I didn't say a word. I just held up the small plastic bag. She squinted, her professional curiosity piqued. She took the bag from my hand, holding it up to the pale afternoon light. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly as she identified the object inside. "Where?" she asked, her voice a low, sharp command. "At the edge of the clearing," I said. "Tucked under the base of a corn stalk, right where the shooter would have been standing if they'd been using the pickup for cover. It's a 9mm casing, Detective." Rossi stared at the casing, then looked over at the green Ford pickup, then back at the evidence bag. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the established narrative of the angry farmer crumbling and reforming around this single tiny piece of evidence. "Hemlock's weapons are a shotgun and a .22 rifle," I stated, pressing the advantage. "We both know that. He doesn't own a 9mm handgun. I've known the man my whole life. He's not the type. This casing doesn't fit our suspect." "It fits our victim," she countered, her mind already moving to the next possibility. A man like Reed, a developer making risky deals, might have carried a weapon for protection. "And shot himself in the chest, then hid the gun and ejected the casing a dozen feet away?" I asked. "No. The killer dropped this. They made a mistake." For a long moment, Rossi was silent. She walked a few paces away, her back to me, looking out over the vast, silent fields. She was a good detective, I knew that. She was tough and driven, but she wasn't so blinded by her own theory that she couldn't see the truth when it was laid at her feet. The evidence, not the story, was what mattered. She turned back to me, her expression a mask of grim professionalism. "All right," she said, handing the evidence bag back to me as if passing a baton. "Bag it and tag it officially. I'll get it sent to the lab for ballistics and fingerprint analysis, though I doubt we'll get a print off it." She then raised her voice. "All right, everyone, pack it up. We're done here." The forensics team stopped what they were doing, surprised but unquestioning. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. On the porch, Bill Hemlock, who had been watching the entire exchange, stood up slowly. He didn't look triumphant, just tired. Rossi walked over to him, her demeanor changed. It was no longer prosecutorial, it was professional. "Mr. Hemlock, we're finished with our search. Nothing was found that incriminates you in this crime. You are no longer a person of interest. However, I must ask that you remain available for further questioning as a witness." Bill just nodded, his eyes finding mine over Rossi's shoulder. He gave me a look of quiet, profound gratitude that said more than any words could. As the state vehicles pulled away one by one, Rossi and I stood by our respective cars. The investigation was now back to square one, but it was a better, truer square one than before. "So, what's our next move?" I asked. "Our next move," Rossi said, "is to pivot. Hard. We've been looking at this all wrong. We've been focused on the victim's connection to the land. But what if the motive wasn't about the land at all? What if Hemlock's farm was just a convenient meeting spot, and a convenient place to dump a body and frame an obvious suspect?" She was right. The killer hadn't just murdered Michael Reed, they had tried to murder the investigation, too, by sending it down a dead-end road. "The witness, Eleanor Peterson," Rossi continued, thinking aloud. "She described the truck as dark, muddy, and old. Generic. But what if it wasn't Bill Hemlock's truck she saw? What if it was another one just like it?" "There are hundreds of trucks like that in this county," I said, the scale of the task daunting. "Yes," she said, a new, determined glint in her eye. "But how many of them are owned by someone who also owns a 9mm pistol and had a reason to meet a real estate developer from Omaha in a cornfield at 10:30 at night?" The question hung in the air. We no longer had a suspect. But we had a murder weapon, a new profile of our killer, someone smarter and more calculating than we had thought, and a whole town full of secrets left to uncover. The neat, simple story was dead. And the real, complicated investigation had just begun. The morning after Bill Hemlock's release was gray and overcast, the sky the color of slate. It matched the mood at the sheriff's department perfectly. The investigation had been reset to zero. We had a victim, Michael Reed, and a murder weapon, a 9mm pistol. But our prime suspect was gone, the motive was in question, and the killer was a ghost, a shadow driving a common truck who had outsmarted us at every turn. It felt like we weren't just investigating a murder, we were in a chess match against a player we couldn't see. I was nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee at my desk when the phone rang. It was Detective Rossi. She sounded like she hadn't slept either, but her voice was sharp, energized with a new sense of direction. "Meet me at the Daily Grind in 20 minutes, she said without preamble. My Omaha team sent over their preliminary background on our victim. It's illuminating. Rossi choosing the diner for a meeting was a sign. It meant she was starting to understand how Harmony Creek worked, that the real town business got done over coffee and bacon, not in sterile offices. When I walked in, she was already in a corner booth, a laptop open in front of her, a half-empty mug at her elbow. Sarah gave me a questioning look as I passed the counter, and I just gave a slight shake of my head. "Morning," I said, sliding into the booth opposite her. "Let's get to it," Rossi began, turning her laptop screen toward me. Michael Reed wasn't the picture of success he appeared to be. His company, Apex Land Holdings, was leveraged to the hilt. He had poured every cent he had, and a lot of money he didn't have, into this wind farm project. According to his business partner, if the Harmony Creek deal fell through, the company was finished. Reed was facing financial ruin. "So he was desperate," I said. "A desperate man might make enemies." "Exactly," Rossi agreed. "He was cutting corners, making promises he couldn't keep. But that's not the most interesting part. His financials show a pattern of large, weekly cash withdrawals for the past 2 months. Always the same amount, $5,000. Untraceable. His wife had no idea. His partner knew nothing about it. Blackmail. An off-the-books payoff. I guessed. That's what we're thinking," Rossi said, her eyes gleaming with intensity. "Now, look at this." She clicked a file, bringing up a spreadsheet. "These are Reed's cell phone records for the last month. Dozens of calls to contractors, investors, county officials, and one number that stands out." She highlighted a row on the screen. It was a number with our local 308 area code. It had been called 8 times in the last 2 weeks alone, including twice on the day of the murder. The last call was placed at 9:30 p.m., just minutes before Reed pulled into the gas and go. "That number doesn't belong to Bill Hemlock," I stated, my pulse quickening. "Not even close," Rossi confirmed. "It's a burner phone, a prepaid cell purchased for cash at a big box store in Grand Island a month ago. Untraceable." My heart sank. Another dead end. "But," she said, holding up a single finger, "the person using the burner wasn't as smart as they thought. The phone was only activated a month ago, but the SIM card was used briefly in another phone before it was placed in the burner." "And you traced the old phone?" I asked, leaning forward. "The old phone's IMEI number was registered to a 2-year contract with Verizon," she said, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She minimized the spreadsheet, revealing a new screen with a name and an address. "The contract belongs to a resident of Harmony Creek." My eyes scanned the screen, my brain struggling to make sense of the name displayed there in stark, black letters. It felt like a punch to the gut. It was a name I knew. A name I had just praised for helping us get our first break in the case. The phone was registered to Mark Gable, Timmy Gable's father. I just stared at the screen. Mark Gable was a mechanic who ran a small, perpetually struggling garage in town. He was a quiet man, a decent man, as far as anyone knew. He was a widower, raising his teenage son on his own. He drove an old, beat-up, dark blue Ford pickup truck. A truck that was always coated in a layer of grease and mud. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening certainty. The secret phone calls. The weekly cash payments. The desperate developer and the struggling mechanic. Michael Reed wasn't just in Harmony Creek for the land. He had another, secret connection to this town. A connection that led him to a late-night meeting that got him killed. And the boy who had so nervously and honestly given me the lead about the black Lexus, his father was the one Reed had been calling. His father was the one with the untraceable phone. His father was the one who drove a truck that perfectly matched the description. "How?" Rossi's voice broke through my shock. "Do you know this man?" I looked up from the laptop, my gaze meeting hers. "Yeah," I said, my own voice sounding hollow. "I know him. Everybody knows him." I pushed myself out of the booth, my coffee forgotten. The case had just become deeply, terribly personal. Before, I was investigating a crime against my town. Now, it felt like I was investigating my town itself, and every answer we found seemed to point toward people I had known and trusted my entire life. I left the diner in a daze, the cheerful jingle of the bell on the door sounding like a funeral toll. The world outside looked the same familiar storefronts, the same people nodding hello as I passed. But everything felt different, tainted. Mark Gable, the quiet mechanic who fixed my first car, a man who always had a smudge of grease on his cheek and a tired but kind smile for his son. And now, he was at the center of a homicide investigation. Back in my cruiser, I sat for a long moment, the engine off, just staring at the steering wheel. Detective Rossi got into the passenger seat, her presence grounding me in the reality of the situation. "This complicates things," she said, stating the obvious with calculated calm. "The son is our key witness, and the father is now our prime suspect." "Timmy's a good kid," I said, the words feeling defensive, protective. "He came forward. He helped us. There's no way he knows anything about this." "I agree," Rossi said, to my surprise. "Which makes him both a valuable asset and a potential liability. The father, Mark, doesn't know that we've made the connection. We need to leverage that. We need more information before we bring him in. A direct confrontation right now is too risky. He could lawyer up, destroy evidence, or just disappear." "So what's the plan?" I asked. "My team is running a deep background check on Mark Gable as we speak. Financials, credit history, any priors, no matter how minor. We need to establish a motive for those $5,000 payments," she explained. "Your job is trickier. You need to talk to the son again." My stomach twisted into a knot. "What do I say to him?" "As little as possible," she instructed. "You're just following up. Tell him you're re-interviewing everyone who saw Reed that night. You need to be the friendly local deputy, just double-checking the details. Ask about his father. Casually. Ask about his truck. See if Timmy can give us an alibi for his dad on the night of the murder without even realizing what he's doing. Be careful, Cal. The kid trusts you. Don't break that unless you have to." It was a horrible assignment, a necessary deception that felt like a betrayal. I found Timmy at the Gables' small, tidy house on the edge of town. The garage where Mark worked was attached to the house, and the familiar dark blue Ford pickup was parked out front. It was old, dented, and caked in a layer of dirt and mud that made my blood run cold. Timmy was in the driveway, shooting hoops by himself. He smiled when he saw my cruiser pull up. It was a genuine, open smile that made me feel like a complete heel. "Hey, deputy," he said, catching the basketball under his arm. "Find anything with that camera footage?" "You bet we did, Timmy." "It was a huge help," I said, forcing a casual tone. I leaned against the cruiser, trying to look relaxed. "I'm just here doing some follow-up, talking to a few people again. You mind if I ask you a couple more questions?" "Yeah, sure. Of course." "That night, did you happen to see your dad? Was he working late in the garage?" Timmy thought for a moment. No, he was out that night. He had to go pick up a part for a transmission job he was working on. Said he was driving out toward Grand Island to get it from a guy he knows. He left around 7 and got back late. I was already in bed." Grand Island. It was in the opposite direction of the crime scene, a perfect alibi if it was true. But it was also the same city where the burner phone had been purchased. Coincidence? His truck running okay? I asked, nodding toward the blue Ford. "I know those old models can be temperamental." "Oh yeah, she runs fine," Timmy said with a touch of pride. "Dad's a great mechanic. He can fix anything." My eyes lingered on the truck. The mud on the wheel wells was dark and thick. It looked exactly like the soil from the cornfields along the creek. "Things been going okay for you guys?" I asked, shifting the topic, trying to sound like a concerned family friend. "Your dad's business holding up?" A shadow passed over Timmy's face. "It's been tough," he admitted quietly. "The new chain auto shop on the highway took a lot of his business. Dad's been stressed, worried about money." He paused, then his expression brightened slightly. "But it's getting better." He said he landed a big side job recently. Some kind of special restoration project for a rich guy from out of town. He's been working on it at night. There it was. The side job. The rich guy from out of town. The reason a struggling mechanic might suddenly have extra cash. Cash that came in regular $5,000 increments. My heart sank. Timmy wasn't giving his father an alibi. He was unknowingly cementing his motive. That's great, Timmy. I'm glad to hear it, I said, the lie tasting like poison. I thanked him and got back in my cruiser, my mind a chaotic mess of facts and feelings. Mark Gable had a plausible alibi, but it placed him in the same city where the burner phone was bought. He drove a truck that was a perfect match for the one at the crime scene. And according to his own son, he had a secret, lucrative side hustle with a rich man from out of town, right at the time Michael Reed was making large, untraceable cash payments. I radioed Rossi as soon as I was a block away. I told her everything Timmy had said. A side job for a rich client, Rossi repeated, her voice grim. It's all connecting. My team just sent me the initial background on Mark Gable. The bank started foreclosure proceedings on his house 2 months ago. He was about to lose everything. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place. Mark Gable wasn't just struggling, he was desperate. As desperate as Michael Reed. It was a collision of two desperate men. But why would it end in murder? What was the side job? And what could possibly be worth $5,000 a week in cash? The questions were piling up, and I knew the only person who could answer them was Mark Gable himself. The time for casual questions and careful deception was over. The pieces were no longer just connecting, they were forming a tight, inescapable net. Mark Gable's foreclosure provided the desperation. Michael Reed's secret cash payments provided the means. And the burner phone provided the undeniable link between the two men. Timmy's innocent confirmation of the side job was the final strand that pulled the net closed. Detective Rossi was a whirlwind of efficiency. Within 2 hours, armed with the phone records, Gable's financial history, my statement regarding Timmy's comments, and the witness description of the truck, she had a signed warrant from a county judge. It authorized a full search of the Gable property, house and garage, and another warrant for the arrest of Mark Gable on suspicion of murder. As dusk began to settle over Harmony Creek, casting long purple shadows across the landscape, we assembled in the parking lot of the diner. It was me, Rossi, and 2 state troopers she'd called in from the nearest barracks. The sight of 2 additional cruisers in town was already setting the rumor mill on fire. I felt a knot of dread in my stomach. This wasn't going to be a quiet conversation. This was going to be an official raid, an act of force that felt alien to the streets of my town. We go in quiet but firm, Rossi instructed, her voice all business. Troopers, you secure the perimeter and watch the suspect. Cal, you're with me. You know him. You know the son. Help me keep this calm. Calm was the last word I would have used to describe the feeling as we pulled up to the Gable house. The lights were on inside. The dark blue Ford pickup was still parked in the driveway. Through the window of the garage, I could see the bright, stark light of a work lamp. Mark was home. We got out of our cruisers, the synchronized closing of 4 car doors sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet evening. I saw a curtain twitch in the house next door. By morning, this would be the only thing anyone in town talked about for a month. Rossi and I walked up the driveway toward the side door of the garage, which stood slightly ajar. The troopers took up positions at the front and back of the house. As we got closer, I could hear the distinct sound of a power tool whining from inside. Rossi knocked firmly on the door. Mark Gable, this is the police. We have a warrant. Open the door. The sound of the tool stopped abruptly. A moment of silence, then the door creaked open. Mark Gable stood there, wiping his hands on an oily rag. He was wearing greasy overalls, and his face was tired, etched with worry lines. He looked from Rossi's badge to my face, and his expression shifted from confusion to a dawning, horrified understanding. Cal, he said, his voice a bewildered whisper. What is this? Mark, we have a warrant to search the premises, Rossi said, her voice leaving no room for argument as she stepped past him into the garage. I followed, my heart pounding. Timmy, stay in the house. Mark yelled over his shoulder, a protective father's instinct kicking in. This is a mistake. What are you looking for? The garage was cluttered but organized, the way a good mechanic shop should be. Tools lined the walls, and engine parts were neatly arranged on shelves. But in the center of the garage, taking up most of the space, was something that didn't belong. It was a vehicle, covered by a heavy gray tarp. And it wasn't a classic car he was restoring. The shape was too low, too modern, too sleek. Ignoring Mark's protests, Rossi walked directly to the covered vehicle and, with one swift movement, pulled the tarp off. There it was. Michael Reed's black Lexus sedan. The car was partially dismantled. The doors were off, and the interior seats were stacked against a wall. But there was no mistaking it. Taped to the inside of the rear window was the white paper temporary license plate, the last 3 digits, 501. Clearly visible under the harsh garage lights. Mark Gable stared at the exposed car, his face ashen. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once, replaced by a look of utter resignation. "It's not what you think," he stammered, his eyes pleading with me. "He hired me to take it apart, to get rid of it. That's all. And I suppose he also hired you to hold on to this?" one of the troopers said from behind a workbench. He was holding up an evidence bag. Inside was a black 9mm handgun. That was it. The final, damning piece of evidence. The murder weapon and the victim's car, all in the suspect's garage. "Mark Gable," Rossi said, her voice ringing with authority as she produced a pair of handcuffs. "You are under arrest for the murder of Michael Reed. You have the right to remain silent." As she cuffed him, the side door to the garage flew open. Timmy stood there, his face pale with confusion and terror, a plate of food still in his hand. He must have been bringing his dad dinner. He saw the Lexus. He saw the gun in the evidence bag. He saw his father in handcuffs. The plate slipped from his fingers and shattered on the concrete floor. "Dad!" he cried, his voice breaking. Mark wouldn't look at his son. He just hung his head, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The troopers led him out of the garage, his movements stiff and mechanical. I stayed behind for a moment, frozen, my gaze locked on Timmy. The bright, helpful kid who had been so proud of his dad, the mechanic who could fix anything. His world had just been shattered into a million pieces, just like the plate on the floor. And I, the local deputy he trusted, had been the one to swing the hammer. The flashing blue and red lights of the cruisers washed over the Gable's small house, painting the scene in strokes of emergency and despair. Mark was gone, taken to the county jail, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than any noise. In the center of that silence stood Timmy, a ghost in his own home, his eyes fixed on the shattered plate on the garage floor as if it held the answers to the universe. The state troopers had done their job, securing the scene, but now they stood by awkwardly, their presence an intrusion on a deeply personal moment of grief. This part wasn't in their training manual. Detective Rossi was on her phone, coordinating with the district attorney, her voice a low, professional murmur. "That left me. It was my town, my mess to help clean up." I walked over to Timmy, my boots crunching on the broken ceramic. "Timmy," I said softly. He didn't look up. "Son, we need to find a place for you to stay tonight. Do you have any family nearby? An aunt, grandparents?" He shook his head, a single, jerky motion. "Just us," he whispered, his voice choked. "Since my mom, it's just been me and Dad." My heart ached for him. He was a 16-year-old kid who had just watched his entire world implode. I couldn't leave him here. I made a call to Sarah from the diner. She was the closest thing Harmony Creek had to a town matriarch. Without hesitation, she said she'd be right over, that she'd get the spare room ready. She didn't ask for details, she just heard the need in my voice. While we waited, I sat with Timmy on the front steps of his house, the flashing lights now turned off, leaving us in the quiet darkness. He didn't cry. He was in shock, a state of numb disbelief. I didn't push him to talk. I just sat there, a silent presence, letting him know he wasn't completely alone. When Sarah's car pulled up, she enveloped him in a hug that was fierce and maternal, and for the first time, the boy's shoulders began to shake. I watched them drive away, another piece of my town's innocence broken beyond repair. An hour later, I was back in that soulless, beige interrogation room. This time, Mark Gable sat across from me and Rossi. He wasn't the stubborn, angry farmer that Bill Hemlock had been. He was a broken man. The fight was gone, his eyes were hollow, and his only concern was for his son. "Is he okay?" Mark asked, his voice raspy. "Timmy, is he okay?" "He's safe," I told him. "He's with Sarah down at the diner for tonight. I'll make sure social services knows he has community support." A look of immense relief washed over his face. He nodded, took a deep, shuddering breath, and seemed to make a decision. "I'll tell you everything," he said, looking at Rossi. "I don't want a lawyer. I just want this to be over." For the next hour, he talked, and the final tragic pieces of the mystery clicked into place. It wasn't a story of blackmail or a simple murder for hire. It was a story of two men drowning in desperation who had clung to each other and ended up pulling both of them under. "My garage was failing," Mark began, his voice flat and tired. "The bank was going to take my house. Timmy and we would have been on the street. Then this man, Reed, shows up one day. He'd heard I was a good mechanic, that I could be discreet. According to Mark, Michael Reed wasn't looking for a hitman. He was looking for a partner in a crime of his own. Reed, facing financial ruin, had concocted a desperate plan: insurance fraud. He had just bought the brand new Lexus, and he was going to report it stolen, pocket the $70,000 insurance payout, and use it to save his company. He just needed one thing: a mechanic who could make a new car disappear, piece by piece, so it could never be found. He offered me $25,000 in cash, Mark said, shamefaced. $5,000 a week for 5 weeks. It was enough to pay off the bank, to save my house, to save my son from being homeless. What was I supposed to do? I said yes. The secret side job was dismantling the Lexus. The burner phone was their method of communication. The meeting in the cornfield wasn't an ambush. It was supposed to be the final step of the plan. He drove the car out there that night, Mark continued, his eyes focused on his cuffed hands on the table. I was supposed to meet him. He'd give me the keys and the last of the cash, and I'd drive the car back to my garage. He'd wait an hour, then call the police and report it stolen from the side of the road. It was all planned. What went wrong, Mark? I asked gently. He looked up, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the fear he must have felt that night. He was different, agitated, paranoid. He gave me the keys, but not the money. He said the plan had changed, that I was a loose end. He said he couldn't trust me to stay quiet. Mark swallowed hard. Then he pulled a gun on me, the one you found. He said he was sorry, but he couldn't risk it. The breath caught in my throat. Self-defense. We struggled, Mark whispered, reliving the moment. It was dark. I was terrified. The gun, it just went off. It was so loud. He just fell. There was so much blood. I didn't know what to do. I panicked. I took the gun, I got in his car, and I drove away. I hid the car in my garage, just like we'd planned, but it was different now. I was a killer. The case was solved, but there was no triumph, no satisfaction, just a profound, aching sadness. It was a story without a villain, only victims. A greedy, desperate man who had pushed another desperate man to the edge. Mark Gable had made a terrible choice, but he hadn't gone into that cornfield intending to kill. He had gone to save his family. When he was finished, he just sat there, the confession having drained the last of his energy. Rossi read him his rights again, and he was formally charged. It would be up to a jury to decide if it was murder or manslaughter. I walked out of the station into the cold, pre-dawn air. The streetlights of Harmony Creek seemed dimmer than before. We had found the killer, but we hadn't restored any sense of order. We had only uncovered the quiet desperation hiding just beneath the surface of our peaceful little town, a desperation that had cost one man his life and another man his freedom. In the days that followed Mark Gable's confession, a strange and somber quiet settled over Harmony Creek. The storm had passed, the lightning had struck, and now the town was left to survey the damage in the quiet, gray light of the aftermath. The news of the real story, the insurance fraud, the struggle, the accidental nature of the killing, had spread from the diner outward, carried on whispers of sympathy and judgment. The case was closed, the paperwork was filed, but for us, the story was far from over. There was no sense of victory, no satisfaction in a job well done. When I walked into the daily grind for my morning coffee, the conversations didn't stop, but they changed. The mood was heavy with a kind of shared grief. Mark Gable wasn't a monster, he was one of them. A man driven to the edge by the same financial pressures they all understood. People looked at me differently. I was no longer just Cal, the local kid in a uniform. I was the agent of this tragedy, the one who had pulled back the curtain on a neighbor's desperation and exposed it to the world. They respected what I did, but there was a new distance in their eyes. I had enforced the law, but in doing so, I had broken a part of the community. My biggest concern was Timmy. I knew Sarah was taking good care of him, but the boy was adrift. I found him a few days later on the bleachers overlooking the high school football field, just staring out at the empty gridiron. He looked smaller, older, and utterly lost. I sat down a few feet away, leaving a space between us. For a long time, we just sat in silence, watching the wind blow a few stray leaves across the field. "They're going to send him to prison for a long time, aren't they?" he finally asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I chose my words carefully. "His lawyer is going to argue it was self-defense, Timmy. That it wasn't premeditated murder. That will make a difference. But, yes, he'll have to serve time." He picked at a splinter on the wooden bleacher. "He was just trying to keep the house," he said, more to himself than to me. "He didn't want us to lose everything. He did it for me." The last 3 words were heavy with a guilt that no 16-year-old should ever have to carry. What your dad did was wrong, Timmy. He broke the law, and that has consequences, I said gently. But why he did it, the love a father has for his son, that's not something the law can really judge. It's more complicated than that. He looked at me then, his eyes full of a pain that was raw and deep. You're the one who arrested him. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. But it hit me harder than any shout would have. Yes, I said, my voice quiet. I was. That was my job. He was silent for another minute. When I told you about that car, about the man at the gas station, I thought I was helping you. I thought I was helping do something good. You were, I said with absolute conviction. You helped us find the truth, Timmy. The truth is always a good thing, even when it's hard. You did the right thing. You have to believe that. I wasn't sure if he did. I wasn't even sure if I did. But it was the only anchor I could offer him. I told him the whole town was there for him, that he wasn't alone, and that I'd be there to help him with whatever he needed. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a start. Later that afternoon, I found myself driving out on the county roads, my thoughts churning. On impulse, I turned down the lane to the Hemlock farm. I found Bill in his barn, the same place I'd confronted him just a week ago, a lifetime ago. The air was no longer thick with suspicion, just the familiar, comforting smells of hay and earth. He was mending a piece of tack, his movements slow and deliberate. He saw me and just nodded, gesturing to a hay bale. I sat down. Heard the whole story, Bill said after a minute of silence. About Mark Gable. It's a damn shame. It is, I agreed. He put his tools down and looked at me, his gaze clear and direct. You took a lot of heat for looking at me first. Heard some folks saying you were too quick to accuse one of your own. The evidence pointed your way, Bill. I had to follow it. I know, he said. And when the evidence changed, you followed it again. That's the job. It ain't about being liked. It's about being right. He picked up a polishing cloth and began rubbing it over the leather in his hands. This whole mess, it put something ugly in the air. Suspicion. It's a poison. Makes you look at your neighbors different. Makes you wonder. I'm glad it's over. I'm glad the truth is out. We sat there for a while longer, 2 men who had been on opposite sides of an investigation, now just 2 neighbors finding a moment of peace. Bill Hemlock, the man my investigation had almost destroyed, was the one person who seemed to understand the weight I was carrying. Driving back to town as the sun began to set, the harvested fields looked barren and stark. The case of the body in the cornfield was officially closed. We had a killer in custody and a confession that laid out the whole tragic story. But there was no neat conclusion. There was just a quiet mechanic waiting for his judgment, a teenage boy trying to rebuild a shattered life, and a town that was a little less innocent, a little more broken than it had been before. The whispers in the corn had been silenced, but their echoes would linger for a very long time. October bled into November. The last of the corn was harvested, leaving the fields around Harmony Creek looking stark and vulnerable under a vast, gray sky. The vibrant colors of autumn had faded to a uniform brown, and a persistent, biting wind served as a constant reminder that winter was on its way. The change of seasons felt fitting. The feverish intensity of the murder investigation had cooled, replaced by the slow, methodical grind of the justice system and a town trying to find its footing on unfamiliar ground. Mark Gable was in the county jail, awaiting his preliminary hearing. His public defender was building a case for manslaughter, arguing that the shooting was a tragic result of a struggle, not a premeditated act. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see how the law would treat one of its own. The initial shock had given way to a quiet, pervasive sadness. My days were filled with paperwork. I typed up final reports, logged evidence, and coordinated with the district attorney's office. It was the unglamorous but necessary work that follows a major case. Detective Rossi had returned to Omaha, but we spoke on the phone regularly, tying up loose ends. For the wider world, the case was essentially over. For us, the ripples were still spreading. It was on a particularly cold Tuesday afternoon that one of those ripples arrived at our front door. A woman walked into the station, dressed in a simple but elegant black coat that looked out of place in our dusty lobby. She was slim, with tired, intelligent eyes and an air of quiet resolve. I knew who she was before she even introduced herself. "I'm looking for Deputy Hayes," she said, her voice steady. "My name is Catherine Reed. I was Michael Reed's wife." I stood up, my mind momentarily blank. I had never considered that she might come here, to this place. To us. I showed her into the small conference room, the only place in the station that didn't feel like a closet or a cage. I offered her a coffee, which she accepted with a grateful nod. "Thank you for seeing me, Deputy," she began, cradling the warm mug in her hands. "I needed to. I don't know. See the place. Understand it. I'm very sorry for your loss, Mrs. Reed," I said, the words feeling horribly inadequate. She gave a small, sad smile. "Thank you. I'm sorry for your town's loss, too. I've read the reports. I know the story Mr. Gable told. The story about the insurance fraud." She looked down into her coffee. "The tragic thing is, I believe it. Michael, he was a good man, but he was drowning. I knew he was in trouble, but I had no idea how deep." Her composure was remarkable. I had expected tears, anger, accusations. Instead, she radiated a profound, weary sorrow. "He kept secrets," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "He thought he was protecting me, protecting our family. He made this desperate, stupid plan to save his company, and it got him killed. I'm angry at the man who shot him, but I'm angry at my husband, too. Angry for the choices he made that brought him here, to a cornfield in the middle of nowhere." We talked for nearly an hour. She wanted to know about Mark Gable, about his son. I told her about Mark's desperation, about the foreclosure, about how his love for his son was at the root of his terrible decision. I didn't make excuses for him, but I gave her the context. I painted a picture of a man, not a monster. She listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "It's a story with no villains, isn't it?" she finally said, her eyes welling up for the first time. "Just fools. My husband and yours. A couple of desperate fools." The way she said "yours" made it clear she was talking about Mark Gable as one of our own. Before she left, she asked one last thing. "The boy, his son, is he being cared for?" "He is," I assured her. "The town is looking after him. He's a good kid caught in something awful." She nodded, seeming to find some small comfort in that. She stood to leave, pausing at the door. "Thank you, Deputy, for your honesty. It helps in a strange way." I watched her walk to her car and drive away, heading back to her life in Omaha, a life that had been irrevocably broken by a single panicked shot in the dark. Her visit had been a strange sort of gift. It had taken the faceless victim from the cornfield and given him a human story, as complicated and tragic as the story of his killer. Later that week, I saw Timmy Gable downtown. He was walking home from school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He saw me, and for a moment, he hesitated. Then he gave me a small, brief nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was recognition. It was a sign that the ties that held our small community together, though stretched and frayed, had not been completely severed. The legal system would move forward with its cold, hard facts. But the healing, I realized, would happen in these small, quiet moments, in a widow's search for understanding, in a boy's reluctant nod, in a town's shared, unspoken grief. The corn was gone from the fields, but now, the slow, difficult work of planting the seeds for a new season had begun. December arrived and draped Harmony Creek in a thick blanket of snow. The stark, barren fields were now soft and white, and the first Christmas lights began to appear on the houses in town, casting a cheerful glow on the early twilight. There was a forced sense of festivity in the air, a collective effort to reclaim the familiar, comforting rhythms of the holiday season after a fall that had been anything but. The legal process, which had seemed so distant, finally delivered its verdict, not with the bang of a gavel in a dramatic trial, but with a quiet rustle of paperwork. The district attorney had reviewed the case in its entirety. Mark Gable's confession, the evidence of the insurance fraud scheme, the forensic report that suggested a close-quarter struggle, and the fact that the murder weapon was registered to Michael Reed. In the end, they offered a plea bargain. Mark would plead guilty to the charge of voluntary manslaughter. It was a just outcome, a legal acknowledgement of the tragedy's complex, messy truth. It recognized that a life had been taken, but it also recognized that it had not been an act of calculated evil. Mark's sentence would be significant, 7 to 10 years, but it was not the life sentence a murder conviction would have carried. It was a punishment, but it was also a promise of an eventual end. I was the one who went to tell Timmy. He was still living with Sarah, in the small guest room above the diner. He'd gone back to school and was making a quiet, determined effort to stitch his life back together. I found him in the diner's kitchen, helping Sarah peel potatoes for the dinner rush. He had become a fixture there, a quiet, helpful presence. We sat at an empty booth in the back, the cheerful sound of Christmas music from the jukebox feeling a world away. I laid it all out for him, the plea deal, the charge, the likely sentence. I explained what it meant, that his dad was taking responsibility for his actions, and that now, for the first time, they would have a definite timeline. A difficult, painful road, but one with a destination. He listened without saying a word, his eyes fixed on the salt shaker on the table. He had grown up a lot in the past 2 months. The scared, confused boy from the night of the arrest was gone, replaced by a young man who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "So, he could be out before I'm 30, Timmy said, his voice quiet. It was a stark, pragmatic calculation that broke my heart. "Yes," I said. "With good behavior, it's very possible." He nodded slowly, processing it. "It's better than never," he finally whispered. "Thank you for telling me in person, Cal." There was a new maturity in the way he said my name. I was no longer just deputy. I was Cal again. It was a small thing, a tiny shift, but it felt like a crack of light in a dark room. It was the beginning of a different kind of peace between us. The news of the plea deal brought a sense of closure to the town. There would be no trial to reopen the wounds, no need to choose sides. The quiet sadness remained, but it was now laced with a feeling of relief. Justice, in its own imperfect way, had been served. A week before Christmas, I received a call from the town's only lawyer, a semi-retired old man named Arthur Vance. He asked me to stop by his office. "Got something strange for you to look at, Caleb," he said, peering at me over his spectacles. He pushed a file across his cluttered desk. "Received this from an Omaha law firm yesterday. It's an anonymous trust, set up for the benefit of Timothy Gable. It's to be used for his college education and living expenses until he's 25. I opened the file. The legal language was dense, but the numbers were clear. Someone had deposited a significant amount of money into an account for Timmy. "Who's the benefactor?" I asked, though I already had a strong suspicion. Arthur smiled. "It's officially anonymous, but the law firm that created it is the same one that represents the estate of the late Michael Reed." I just stared at the document. Catherine Reed, the widow, in an act of quiet, unbelievable grace, had reached across the divide of her own grief to provide a future for the son of the man who had killed her husband. She had seen the full scope of the tragedy and had chosen not to perpetuate it. She had decided that one ruined life was enough. I left the lawyer's office and walked out onto Main Street. The snow was falling again, big, soft flakes that muffled all sound. The Christmas lights twinkled against the deepening blue of the evening sky. For the first time since that crisp October morning, the oppressive weight of the case felt like it was finally lifting, not just from me, but from the town itself. The story of the body in the cornfield would always be a part of our history, a dark chapter of desperation and loss. But it would now also be a story of a community's resilience, a boy's quiet strength, and a widow's incredible capacity for grace. The scales of justice had been balanced by an act of mercy, a final, unexpected twist in a story that I would never forget. A year can feel like a lifetime, or it can pass in the blink of an eye. In Harmony Creek, it felt like both. Another October had arrived, painting the leaves in the same brilliant shades of red and gold. The corn stood tall in the fields, heavy and ripe for harvest, its stalks whispering in the same dry, rustling language. From a distance, everything looked exactly as it had a year ago. But up close, if you knew where to look, you could see the changes. The case had changed me. I was still Deputy Caleb Hayes, but the idealistic kid who had once believed in simple good and simple evil was gone. I had seen the vast, complicated gray area in between, the landscape of desperation where good people make terrible choices. It made me a more cautious, more compassionate lawman. When I looked at the people in my town now, I saw not just their present, but the hidden histories and silent struggles they carried with them. The most visible change was in Timmy Gable. He was a senior in high school now, taller and leaner, with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. The trust fund Catherine Reed had established was no longer a secret. The story had eventually come out, another layer in the town's complex legend. It had given Timmy more than just money for college. It had given him a future he could focus on, a tangible goal to work toward. I saw him at the Gas and Go one afternoon. He was filling up the old family pickup truck, which he now drove. He'd cleaned it up, and the engine hummed with a well-cared-for smoothness. "Hey, Cal," he said, giving me a genuine smile. It was a smile that reached his eyes now. "Timmy, how are things?" "They're okay," he said. "I got my college applications in. Thinking about studying mechanical engineering." He patted the hood of the truck. "Dad taught me everything about engines. Figure I should put it to good use. The right way." The pride in his voice was unmistakable. He was honoring his father's skills, not his mistakes. He told me he drove to the state penitentiary once a month to visit his dad. He said the meetings were hard, but they were good. They were rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of difficult honesty. He was no longer a boy defined by his father's tragedy. He was a young man forging his own path. The town had found a new equilibrium, too. The apex land holding signs that had once dotted the county line were gone. The wind farm project had died with Michael Reed, and his company had been dissolved in a sea of debt. The farmers who had signed options on their land were released from their contracts. The threat of massive change had vanished, and in its place, a renewed appreciation for the familiar rhythm of farm life had settled in. Bill Hemlock, once the town pariah, was now seen as a kind of folk hero, the stubborn old farmer who had, in a strange roundabout way, saved the valley from being covered in giant turbines. I stopped by his farm on a crisp autumn afternoon. He was on his tractor, bringing in the last of his soybean crop. He cut the engine as I approached, the sudden silence filled by the chirping of crickets. "Harvest looking good, Bill," I said. "Can't complain," he grunted, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a worn glove. "It's a quiet year. Thank the Lord for that." We both knew what he meant. The quiet wasn't just an absence of noise. It was an absence of fear, of suspicion, of flashing lights on a lonely service road. It was the return of a peace that no one in Harmony Creek would ever take for granted again. Later that day, my patrol route took me down County Road 4. I slowed the cruiser as I approached the turnoff, the unmarked dirt lane that led back toward the creek. On impulse, I pulled over and got out. I walked to the edge of the cornfield, the same one where it had all begun. The scene of the crime was just a field again. There was no trace of the yellow tape, no sign of the trampled stalks or the forensics teams. Nature had reclaimed it. The corn stood in silent, golden rows, swaying gently in the breeze. It held no secrets anymore. The story was told, the ghosts laid to rest. I stood there for a long time, looking out at the endless sea of gold under the vast Nebraska sky. I thought about the two desperate men who had met here, their separate worlds colliding in a single fatal moment. I thought about the families they had broken, and the unexpected grace that had emerged from the wreckage. A year ago, this field had represented the darkness hidden beneath the surface of our quiet town. But now, it was just a field. The harvest was ready, winter was coming, and soon after, the promise of a new spring. Life, I realized, was a lot like that field. It could be a place of unimaginable tragedy, but it was also a place of resilience, of healing, and of the enduring hope that comes with a new season. 5 years. It's long enough for seasons to blur together, for fresh grief to soften into quiet memory, and for a town's deep wounds to finally become scars you no longer notice every day. In the 5 years that followed the death of Michael Reed, Harmony Creek settled back into itself. Sheriff Brody was talking more and more about retirement, and he'd promoted me to chief deputy. The title came with more responsibility and a lot more paperwork, but my job remained the same, to watch over the quiet, predictable rhythm of my hometown. The gable house had been sold a few years back to a young family, but the garage beside it had sat empty, a silent, locked-up reminder of the story that everyone knew but rarely spoke of. It was a place frozen in time, a relic of the town's darkest chapter. Until one sunny afternoon in late spring, I was driving my patrol route when I saw a U-Haul truck parked in the driveway. A young man with broad shoulders and a familiar, determined set to his jaw was wrestling a heavy toolbox out of the back. It took me a second to place him. The boy I remembered was gone, replaced by a man. "Timmy," I said, pulling the cruiser over and getting out. He turned, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "Chief Deputy Hayes," he said, his voice deeper now. He wiped a hand on his jeans and extended it. His handshake was firm, confident. "Just Cal is fine, Timmy." "It's good to see you, Cal," he said. He looked great. He'd filled out, and the haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for so long was completely gone, replaced by a clear, focused light. We stood there in the driveway, catching up. He had graduated from the University of Nebraska with top honors, a degree in mechanical engineering clutched in his hand. He'd had job offers, good ones, from companies in Omaha and even out of state. "But this is home," he said, gesturing to the old garage. "I used the last of the trust fund to buy the garage and the property back from the bank. Figured it was time to put it to good use." The implications of his words settled over me. He was reopening his father's shop. He was coming home to reclaim his family's name, not by running from the past, but by building a new future right on top of it. "My dad gets out on parole in 6 months, Timmy told me, his voice steady. There was no shame in it, just a statement of fact. He's paid his debt. He's a different man. Quieter. Full of remorse, but ready to start over. I thought maybe he could use a place to work. We could run the shop together." The idea was audacious, brave. Some in town might whisper, might find it hard to forget. But hearing it from Timmy, it felt like the most natural, hopeful thing in the world. It was an act of profound love and forgiveness. What will you call it? I asked, looking at the faded peeling sign above the garage door that still read Gable's Auto Repair. I'm keeping the name, he said with a defiant sort of pride. It's a good name. My dad was a good mechanic. He made a bad choice. I want to make this place stand for something good again. We talked for a little while longer. He told me he'd kept in touch with Catherine Reed. They exchanged Christmas cards every year. An unlikely, unspoken bond forged in a shared tragedy. He said he'd written her a long letter, thanking her for the future she had given him, a future he promised he wouldn't waste. As I got back into my cruiser, Timmy was already at work, prying the old, heavy garage door open. It groaned in protest, then slid upwards, flooding the dark, dusty space with bright spring sunlight for the first time in years. I drove away with a sense of closure so deep it felt like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. The story had never really been about a body in a cornfield. It was about what came after. It was about a town's capacity to heal, a widow's capacity for grace, and a young man's incredible capacity to build a future out of the wreckage of the past. The ghost of Mark Gable's mistake no longer haunted that garage. In its place was the promise of a new beginning, powered by forgiveness and the steadfast belief that a family name, like a well-built engine, could always be restored. The 6 months after Timmy's return passed with the steady, quiet rhythm of small-town life. Under his determined hands, the old Gable garage was transformed. A new coat of paint covered the weathered siding, new windows gleamed in the sun, and a simple, freshly painted sign that read Gable and Son Auto Repair hung proudly above the door. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to a son's faith in his father. And then, the day we had all been quietly anticipating arrived. I got the call from the warden at the state penitentiary. Mark Gable's parole had been granted. He was being released the next morning. Timmy had planned to drive the 2 hours to pick him up, but he called me the night before, his voice tight with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Cal, he said, would you do me a favor? Would you be the one to bring him home? I want to be here, at the shop, when he arrives. I want him to see it. To see that we have a place to start over. It was a request that went far beyond my official duties as chief deputy. It was a personal plea, an invitation to be part of the final, most difficult chapter of their story. Of course, Timmy, I said without hesitation. I'll be there. The man who walked out of the prison gates the next morning was a ghost of the Mark Gable I remembered. He was thinner, grayer, and the years of incarceration had carved deep lines into his face. But the biggest change was in his eyes. The haunted, desperate look was gone, replaced by a profound, soul-deep quiet. He carried a single cardboard box with his few possessions. He seemed surprised to see me, to see the official cruiser. Timmy asked me to bring you home, Mark, I explained. He nodded, a flicker of emotion passing across his face. He got into the passenger seat, and for the first long stretch of the drive, we didn't speak. We just watched the flat, empty plains of Nebraska roll by, the landscape a blank canvas for the new life he was about to attempt to paint. I heard what you did for Timmy, he finally said, his voice raspy from disuse. What Sarah did, what the whole town did, and that woman, Mrs. Reed. I don't understand it, but I'm grateful. It's a good town, Mark, I said. And Timmy's a good kid. He made it easy for people to want to help him. He's a better man than I am, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. As we reached the outskirts of Harmony Creek, I saw his hands tighten in his lap. This was the hardest part. Facing the place, the people, he had wronged. I didn't drive him straight to the garage. Instead, I pulled into the parking lot of the Daily Grind. What are we doing? He asked, a hint of panic in his voice. You're a free man, Mark, I said. A man's got a right to a cup of coffee in his hometown. I led him inside. The lunch crowd was there, and a hush fell over the room as we entered. It was the moment of truth. Mark stood frozen by the door, ready to be met with glares, with whispers, with open hostility. And for a moment, that's all there was, a thick, uncomfortable silence. Then, Sarah bustled out from behind the counter, a coffee pot in her hand. She walked right up to our table and filled 2 mugs without a word. She looked at Mark, her expression not one of pity or judgment, but of simple, straightforward acceptance. Welcome home, Mark, she said quietly, and then she went back to work. It was like a spell had been broken. A few of the older farmers at the counter gave him a quiet, almost imperceptible nod. Someone else just went back to eating their lunch. There was no parade, no fanfare, but more importantly, there were no pitchforks. It was the town's way of saying, you've paid your debt. The past is the past. Now it's up to you to build a future. When we finally pulled up to the garage, Timmy was waiting out front. He was wiping his hands on a clean rag, just as his father had done on the night of the arrest. But Timmy's face was full of hope. Mark got out of the car and just stood there, staring at the new sign, at the clean windows, at the son who had become a man in his absence. The two of them met in the middle of the driveway. There were no grand pronouncements, just a father and a son, finally reunited, their shared future gleaming like a freshly painted door. Mark pulled Timmy into a hug, and his shoulders shook with the weight of 6 years of remorse and gratitude. I didn't stay. That moment was theirs alone. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror. The lights inside the garage were on, and two figures, a father and a son, were walking inside together, ready to get to work. The story of the body in the cornfield had ended in a place I never would have expected. Not in a courtroom, not in a prison cell, but in the quiet, hopeful light of a restored garage on a peaceful afternoon. Another year turned, as they always do. Autumn returned to Harmony Creek, and with it, the 7th anniversary of the discovery in the cornfield. But it was no longer a date that was marked with any special significance. It had faded from the forefront of the town's memory, becoming just another part of the intricate tapestry of our shared history. The peace that had been so hard-won was now simply the air we breathed. Sheriff Brody had finally announced his retirement, effective at the end of the year. He'd named me his successor, and the town council had unanimously approved it. The transition felt natural, inevitable. The job of watching over this town had become the central purpose of my life. The idealistic young deputy was long gone, replaced by a man who understood that keeping the peace wasn't about preventing trouble from ever happening. That was impossible, but about helping the community navigate the aftermath when it did. Gable and Son Auto Repair had become a town institution. Timmy's engineering knowledge combined with Mark's lifetime of hands-on experience made them the best mechanic team in the county. Their garage was no longer a symbol of a dark past. It was a thriving local business, a place of honest work and second chances. I pulled my cruiser in one afternoon with a tire that had been losing air. The bay doors were open, and the familiar sounds of clanking tools and the low hum of an engine lift filled the air. Timmy slid out from under a pickup truck, his face smudged with grease, and grinned. "Don't tell me the town's top cop got a flat," he joked. "Just a slow leak," I said, smiling back. "Your dad around?" "In the office, wrestling with the new invoicing software," Timmy said, rolling his eyes. "He can rebuild a carburetor blindfolded, but a computer gives him fits." I walked into the small, clean office. Mark Gable sat at a desk, peering at a monitor with a frustrated expression. He looked up and the tension in his face eased. He wasn't the haunted man who had returned from prison. The quiet was still there, but it was a peaceful quiet now, not a broken one. He was a man who had made peace with his past. "Cal," he said, gesturing to the chair. "Good to see you." We talked for a few minutes while Timmy patched my tire. The conversation was easy, normal. We talked about the high school football team's chances this year, about the early frost we'd had. There was no awkwardness, no shadow of the events that had once bound us together in such a terrible way. "You'll never guess who was in here last week," Mark said, leaning back in his chair. "Bill Hemlock." The transmission on his old Ford finally gave out. "The same truck," he trailed off, but we both knew which one he meant. "How was that?" I asked. Mark smiled, a small, genuine smile. "It was fine. We talked about the price of soybeans. He complained about his arthritis. I fixed his truck. He paid his bill." He shook his head in quiet wonder. "He's a good man. This whole town, it gave me something I never thought I'd have again. A normal day." That was it. The ultimate sign that the healing was complete. The man who had been falsely accused, trusting the man who had committed the crime to fix his truck. It was a profound, unspoken act of forgiveness, a testament to the community's capacity to let the past rest. Before I left, Timmy told me he'd recently sent a letter and a framed photo of the new garage to Catherine Reed. He'd received a short, kind note in reply. She had remarried. Her daughters were doing well. She wished him and his father peace and happiness. All the threads, no matter how tangled, had found their own quiet resolutions. I drove away from the garage, my tire perfectly patched, my mind unusually calm. My patrol took me past the edge of town, along the county roads that bordered the now harvested cornfields. The land was resting, waiting for winter. I thought about justice. The law had delivered its verdict years ago, but the truest form of justice, I now believed, was quieter. It was in the hum of a successful business, in a son's pride, in a father's peaceful expression. It was in Bill Hemlock's trust and Catherine Reed's grace. It was in a town's stubborn, compassionate refusal to let one dark chapter define the rest of the story. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the fields. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio with some minor, routine call. I keyed the mic. Chief Deputy Hayes, on my way. I turned the cruiser back toward town, toward the simple, everyday duty of watching over the hard-won peace. The ghosts were gone. There was only the land, the town, and the quiet promise of tomorrow. The day Sheriff Brody retired was the same day I took my oath to replace him. There was no grand ceremony, just a small gathering in the courthouse clerk's office. The room was filled with the familiar faces that had become the anchors of my life. Sarah from the diner, a proud and teary-eyed Bill Hemlock, and standing quietly in the back, both Mark and Timmy Gable. Brody unpinned the old-worn sheriff's badge from his own shirt and pinned it onto mine. The metal was heavy with the weight of decades of service, of countless stories both big and small. It's a heavy thing to carry, Cal, he said, his voice thick with emotion as he shook my hand. But you've got strong shoulders. Just remember, your job isn't to be the town's judge. It's to be its guardian. There's a difference. Afterward, we all ended up where stories in Harmony Creek always seem to begin and end, in a booth at the Daily Grind. Sarah insisted that coffee and pie were on the house. The diner was filled with the low, comfortable hum of a normal afternoon. Looking around, I saw a living map of the past 7 years. I saw Bill Hemlock, no longer a suspect but a respected elder, arguing with another farmer about the weather. I saw Mark and Timmy Gable, laughing together over a shared plate of fries, the past a closed book that no longer defined them. Their presence wasn't a scandal, it was just a fact, as normal as the salt and pepper shakers on the table. They were the town mechanics. That was their story now. I took a slow sip of my coffee and let the moment sink in. I thought back to that first panicked call, to the sight of a single black boot in a sea of gold, to the mystery that had cracked our town's peaceful facade wide open. That case had been my trial by fire, the one that had burned away my naivete and forged me into the man I was today. It had taught me that evil wasn't always a monstrous outsider. Sometimes, it was a quiet desperation that lived right next door. But it had also taught me something more powerful. It had taught me about the resilience of the human spirit. I had seen the worst of my town, but I had also seen its absolute best. I'd seen it in Sarah's unwavering kindness, in Bill's quiet forgiveness, in Catherine Reed's astonishing grace, and most of all, in Timmy Gable's fierce, determined love for his father. This town wasn't special because bad things didn't happen here. It was special because of how it chose to heal when they did. My new radio, sitting on the table beside me, crackled to life. Dispatch to Sheriff Hayes. Hearing my new title spoken aloud for the first time felt both strange and perfectly right. I picked up the radio. Go ahead, dispatch. We've got a call from Mrs. Patterson on Elm Street, the dispatcher's voice said, a hint of amusement in her tone. Says her cat, Mittens, is up the old oak tree again and won't come down. I looked around the diner, at the faces of my town, a community that had been to the brink and back, and was now peacefully debating the merits of apple versus cherry pie. A community that had entrusted its safety, its secrets, and its everyday dramas to me. I keyed the mic, a small smile on my face. Sheriff Hayes to dispatch. Roger that. I'm on my way. I stood up, dropping a few dollars on the table out of habit. Sarah just shooed them away. I nodded to my friends, my neighbors, my town. Then I walked out into the crisp, clean air of another peaceful Nebraska afternoon. The cornfields were resting, the harvest was in, and a cat was stuck in a tree. It was just another day in Harmony Creek. And I was exactly where I was supposed to be.